Joan, I'm so happy to have you here today. I'm so excited that you're the judge for this contest, not only because I love your writing, but also because you are a two-time winner, I think. So you have seen both sides, or you will see both sides. I'm curious, in your opinion, what makes a good short story?
Well, that's a great question. First, though, thank you, Sarah. I'm real, as you said, I'm really happy to be on the other side of an opportunity to read other people's work and take a look at a whole range of people's fiction. So, what makes a good short story to me is, I've published two books of stories. Mostly, I've written short stories. I've also done some novels, but one novel, I'm working on another one. But short stories to me, I think, have the opportunity to shine a light on something very not necessarily narrow, but specific, but in depth. To me, a good short story is has elements of surprise. It moves you in ways you don't expect, but it does it with economy, which I love. It requires the writer to be disciplined and not overtell and not overshow or overspeak. You have to do it with economy. And that to me is the artistry of it too. To have faith that your reader is going to understand if you just suggest things or hint at things. It's a little, I almost feel it almost like painting. There's an element of like, you have to be careful about not overdoing because you don't have that much space. And I do think all subjects you can tell as a novel's worth of material in a short story, but it's the artistry of the economy that I think really makes a big difference. And this is one of the reasons I love it. I love reading short stories. I like writing them for that reason. So.
You mentioned that so many, right, like everything, so much character and development and things like that could be found in a short story. But I was thinking, are there any ideas that are too large for a short story that a short story can't really contain?
Well, I'm not sure because I have read stories that cover a lifetime, and if the writer is skilled, they can make transitions in time so quickly, they can just say 20 years later and then there you are, or after she died, so you can cover enormous amounts of time and you can cover a lot of geography. I may be the only limitation, and yet I'm not even sure this is true is you may have to limit the numbers of how many points of view you can deliver in a short story. But that said, in fact, I had a story years ago that was a finalist in one of the moment contests way back, and it had 4 points of view in it. And a novel, if you have more than 4 points of view, can get a little cumbersome. And so, I think it can be any topic. I think it can be from a craft point of view, can cover great swaths of time, many different points of view, many different subjects, and certainly, deep, significant subjects. They can be world issues and they can be highly individual and personal. So I'm not sure. I don't know. At the moment, I would have to say I can't think of anything. And that said, sometimes you read a 400-page novel inside the head of one person in one day in time, or things like that. So I think both forms, the long form and the short form can cover great swaths, small spots, one person's perspective, many. And you can do an omniscient point of view in a short story too, like you might in a Tolstoy type of novel. So I do think it's open. Yeah, good.
I mean, some of my friends who've kind of either gotten MFAs or are in MFA programs, I know there's this idea that kind of percolates that first you do a short story collection, and then when you graduate, you write a novel. And I'm curious your opinion on that.
Yeah, that's the old thing. You're correct. I mean, it's often viewed as a stepping stone and it's second, it's inferior to novels. And I don't feel that way at all. And it isn't because I was naturally gravitated towards short stories first. It's more that to me, they really are different art forms. And there are some people, I know some novelists who hate writing short stories. They say they can't. And it's possible that they feel that they can't. So it's not necessarily that you learn how to write on a short story. I really think the issue with MFA programs is just it's easier to give feedback on a short story than it is a novel. So it's easier to sort of shoehorn it into the workshop format and the regular student mentor format. But I don't buy that at all. And I think it's just there's that, and then there's sort of mythology. We're all going to write the great American novel. Nobody says we're going to write the great American short story. But yet, some of the best writers, Philip Roth started, I love his short stories, and Bernard Malamud, they were, to me, in many ways, better than many of their novels. So, I don't, and Grace Paley, she only wrote short stories, and they were brilliant. So, Tobias Wolff is like that. So, many writers. It's not like it's a stepchild to the to the novel, the training wheels actually. Mhm.
Well, I mean, are there any short stories that have stayed with you that you've read that you kind of think back on or changed the way you thought or write?
Well, there are a lot that I encountered at different points in time. Like those writers, I read a lot when I was young, and I like them because they gave me an immersion into Jewish life in a literary form. And I love the voices. I love the voice of Grace Paley, and I love the voice of Tilly Olson. Because they were so direct, and they weren't formalistic, and I really liked it. Those were voice-driven pieces that really got into the guts. But it also depends on what you're doing. I remember at one point during my early writing fiction, I came across the work of Mary Gateskill. She really she breaks taboos in good ways. She writes about women in ways that that gave me permission, let's say, because I didn't write about women for a long time when I was first writing, and she really does it in a very let's just say subject matter breaking way that it was very direct. And when I read her work, that really meant a lot to me. And then there were other writers along the way. When I would pick up their book, it would just speak to me right at that time, along those kinds of story collections. One of them was Elizabeth McCracken. I read her book, Here's Your Hat, What's Your Hurry? She's gone on to write novels and I think even a memoir, but this was her first book. And it was great. You could see, without seeing the seams of how a piece is put together, as a student of writing at that time, I would learn from these writers how you can assemble a story or the things you can do in a story. So I can't recall them all. I just read a lot when I was first starting out as a writer, and just getting a lot just from reading different kinds of writers, in terms of what you can do and how you can assemble something, the structure, what you're allowed to write about. A lot of it is in the form of permission, breaking out of little, constraints. That was sort of my path. So, and I came to writing a little later, and I was a lawyer and was a little more, oriented that way, but not so much that I wanted to stay a lawyer. So I read lots of writers as forms of both a personal education and permission to try all kinds of things. Yeah.
Are there any difficulties in the form of writing a short story?
Means particular difficulties to the form in
Yes.
the
Yeah.
book. Um, as I said before, I mean, I think you do, to me, I don't see it as a difficulty. I see it as a positive, but it is a challenge that you have to, ev- every, people say every sentence has to count. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but pretty close. You don't have a lot of leeway but you shouldn't use that leeway writing a novel to have throwaway sentences and stuff that really doesn't belong there either. But you do have to be attentive to the economy and the tone. I wouldn't call it a difficulty, but to me, another of the joys of it is the sound, is the rhythm. To me, short stories well, I think all fiction has an aural, aural, element, and you hear rhythms and you hear sentences, and I think it's maybe a little more pronounced in short stories because of the length. So, but to me, I like that part of it. And I think, one of the difficulties in generally writing fiction is, or I would call it a challenge again, is the tendency to over-engineer the work, to over-manage it, to sort of plot it all out too carefully ahead of time. I'm not a fan of any of that. That's never worked for me, and I don't think it tends to work very well in fiction. So I think whether it's a novel, well, it's challenging with a novel if you don't know where you're going or what you're doing for a long period. But for short stories, I would say for sure, you want to allow yourself to be surprised and just let the sentences pull you through, let the words pull you through. And that, some people find that tremendously challenging because you're nervous, you don't know where it's going, and you don't like that feeling. So, that is one of the challenges, I think, but it's a good one. I think that results in better fiction. Um, certainly for short stories. Yeah.
Is the editing process different for short stories versus novels?
Well, probably. I mean, in the sense that when I go to revise a short story, you can start at word one and read it all the way through. When you do that for a novel, you never get you never get anywhere. You can't always revise everything from the first page. So I do, when I revise a short story, I can start way from the beginning. I can hold the whole thing together in my ear and in my head all at once, which you can't really do with a novel. So you can feel the whole thing as a uniform whole when you go back to revise. And it's not just editing like sentence level, or it's not the surface. I don't mean in a bad way, surface, but it's not just the prose. It's to me, the editing is really more a form of revision. You have to keep re-envisioning, go deeper and deeper. Did you really get to the truth you're trying to get at? And with a short story, it's a little easier in some respect to get to that because you have just the whole thing right in front of you. On the other hand, it can be a little bit elusive because you don't have that much material. You don't have that much plot usually. So you have to really understand what your characters are going through, what the story, and also what the story is trying to tell you. Bernard Malamud, I used to quote him a lot. Now I don't remember every piece of the quote, but he'd say, your first draft is just to get the thing down. Your second one is to see what it is. Your third one is to see what it might be about. And your fourth to your 50th is to make it be what it's about. So you don't know what it's about when you're first writing it. You have to write it and read it many times to figure out what your story is telling you. And you can do that in a short story because you can keep reworking those 15, 20, 10, 20 pages. And so I think I don't know that's the difficulty. To me, that's part of the pleasure of it. I like doing that.
Last question. What tips do you have for our potential submitters to the Moment Karma Fiction Contest?
Yeah, so I would say, certainly with regard to the writing, separate from things like, how to keep yourself in the chair and that kind of thing, how to keep yourself going, is that the things that I have found the most valuable are the notion of getting out of your own way and not over engineering. There's George Saunders is a writer who writes eloquently to me and also doesn't take, with a great deal of both humor and wisdom about the process. He has a wonderful animation. Someone animated a little bit of a video of an interview he did on story writing, and it's called George Saunders on Story. If you Google it, you can see it. It's a 7-minute animation in which he basically says you have to get out of your own way. Your story has its own intentions. And it's weird because you think, well, it's in your head. How come you don't know what it is? But I don't know what it is. His approach is you let the sentences guide you. For some reason, you may not be aware of it. You wrote a sentence. So have faith that the sentence knows more than you do and follow what the sentence is. There's another writer, Ron Carlson. He has a book called Ron Carlson Writes a Story. He goes through the process and he says the job of the fiction writer is just to get to the second sentence. Because if you start thinking at the beginning, well, where's it going? What's it about? What's it going to mean? You can't get there. You have to get there sentence by sentence, but have some faith that what you put on the page is there either for a reason to tell you something. Maybe you eventually take it out. It's just the scaffolding to get you to the next part. But the main advice I would say for writing is to put your intentions aside and have faith in your actual sentences and let them pull you along, even if you don't know why you're writing what you're writing or where it's going to go. And that to me is a big piece of advice that I found helpful. And when I've taught, I think people in my classes have found it helpful. That's what I would say to submitters, and also to allow yourself to be surprised, and enjoy the surprise and try not to get too rattled. I mean, it's hard not to be rattled, but you can't control it. And when you let go of controlling it, you get a great deal of pleasure and you get in that zone a little bit where you're removed from the conscious labor and toil of it. So that's what I would say when people sit down to write, let themselves be surprised.
That's fascinating because I think I always thought of short stories that people must sort of start with a map of exactly where they're going and they just follow their roadmap. So it's really interesting to see that it's actually much more free flowing.
Yeah, and when I used to talk, I would say, my one of my sons was in school once. He was told, "Okay, write a short story, outline your beginning, your middle, and the end." And I remember he sort of rudely said to his teacher, "Well, that's not how my mother writes." But that is the assumption. The assumption is you've got it in your head, you've got it mapped out. It's an act of typing and transcription. And there are people who do work that way, especially with novels. But honestly, that tends to be a bit paint by number and over prescribed. But if you let it be free associate, the best work I've ever done has always taken me to a place I never knew I was going to go. And I don't know, I would literally put down a first sentence and I don't know where that sentence would come from. But then from there, you see, well, what is it? You hear something following, maybe the second sentence is like right there in your head, so you just write it down. But it's an interesting thing because writing, unlike, say, music and painting, seems to be a highly, lends itself to cognitive direction. Your brain should be, it's not an emotional thing, or it doesn't come from some other capacity like music and art and dance comes from other capacities. So you think, oh, it's just the same as writing. Well, I was a lawyer, writing a brief or writing a newspaper article, like you may have in the past as a journalist. It's not a cerebral process that way, at least not in the composition. Later you may bring that to it in revision, but it is a far more associative process. And I've heard many other writers talk about this way. And it isn't, if, I mean, there are, as I say, you have people map out, there are literary writers that map out their work, and there are people who write more genre, thrillers, mysteries, they map it out. And at some point, even literary writers will find, I mean, even people, not literary, people who write in the method I'm describing eventually may see patterns and ideas, write down plot ideas. But certainly with short fiction, if you can keep it as free associative as possible, it's just getting the raw material out there. And it's wonderful if it surprises you and takes you someplace you didn't know. And I once heard, I think I've said this before, I once heard the Israeli writer David Grossman at a book festival in Jerusalem, and he was with Paul Auster. They were being interviewed by some Israeli moderator who said, the two of you have written 25 novels between the two of you. How much do you know of your novels before you start? And they both said none. And then Grossman said, I think he's the one who said, if I knew where it was going, I wouldn't write it. I'm in the same in it for the same reason as the reader to discover. And that's the other joy of it for you as the writer. You're not there to necessarily tell what you already know. You're there to discover something about life, and you can't do the discovery if you've pre-planned it all out. In my view, and the way I experience it. So it is quite different from what you you
Yeah.
probably thought, or maybe were instructed as well.
No, well, thank you. I mean, actually, I found this really inspiring. I want to go back and sort of look back at some of my fiction that I've written, and look at it a different way. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I gave a book talk with my most recent book in a synagogue up in the north of Boston, and there was a wonderful man who I gave talk about this process, and the man who came over to me was a retired guy. Said, "I've been a newspaper man my whole life. I've always wanted to write this novel I've got sitting in my house. I'm going home now to write it." He said, "Because I thought I had to know where it was going to go before I started." So these little pieces of information that I pick up from other writers, they in their talks or in their interviews that I read are so liberating because they say there's no one way. There's lots of different ways, but I hope you will go home and pick up your fiction and be less worried about where it's going to go. And if you're worried, get up, walk around, have a drink, some M&Ms, sit down. But yeah, it could be very freeing, and you never know what it might bring you. Yeah.
well, thank you. Thank you very much.